Welcome to this morning session, a conversation with David Eisner. My name is Priscilla Bellini, and I'll be your MC today. First, a little about myself. I'm a journalism student from São Paulo, Brazil, and I have been studying Arabic for 2 years, and I currently work at Contexto magazine. I love getting to know other cultures, and I have had the opportunity to visit Qatar, Costa Rica, and Palestine. I'm thrilled to be here and to welcome you to this exciting conversation with him and introduce our future speaker. David Eisner is one of the premier leaders in volunteering and service. He has vast experience in nonprofit, for-profit, government, and grant-making sectors. In January 2013, he was appointed president and CEO of Repair the World, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to engage the Jewish community in service and volunteering. In 2009, he was appointed by former President Bill Clinton and to serve as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Prior to the Constitution Center, he was appointed by President George Bush in 2003 to assume leadership of the Corporation for National and Community Service. Please join me in welcoming this monumental man, David Eisner.
Enough for me, and I put on my swimming trunks, and my parents said, okay, but be very careful, and there was this young man, at the time, he must have been less than 30, but when I was 8 years old, I thought of him as this very old guy who clearly had a mental challenge and had a very difficult time communicating. And I stood at the top of the stairs in this beautiful swimming pool, and he grabbed onto my hand, and somehow we wrestled each other into the water. And at 8 years old, I gave my first swimming lesson to this guy who was holding on to me for dear life. And I managed to pull him across the pool, and he lifted his legs up, and he was floating, and his sense, his expression of joy, plus this sense of complete trust, and his holding on to me and not letting go, was something that it turns out it stuck with me, and was the thing that I kept coming back to when I was spending my time with these AmeriCorps members, this idea that you can make a difference, that you can hold on to somebody and not let go, and make a huge difference in their life just by being there, and by focusing, and by committing everything that you have. So my wife and I decided it was time to be there and not let go and commit everything we have, and we left the for-profit sector, and instead of spending 18 months at AmeriCorps, I spent almost 6 years, and then after that went into the nonprofit sector. And what I'm doing now is working with communities and trying to build bridges between certain communities of privilege, especially Jewish communities of privilege, and communities that are having a much harder time. And we're doing it through volunteering and service. The organization is called Repair the World. And what we're doing is using sort of an AmeriCorps-like model, where we're bringing full-time young adults, 21 to 26, into a community using a workshop, and they're both working in the community that is our host, and they're organizing to get the rest of the Jewish community and some of the other privileged communities to be a part of it. Come on up and be part of our circle here. So I learned a few things being in the nonprofit, the for-profit, and the government world. I learned things like you never take funders personally, because having been a funder myself, the Corporation for National Community Service, anyone want to guess how much it gives away every year to nonprofits? billion that it gives away every year. And I had no idea, but all of a sudden, I was taller, funnier, smarter. All of my jokes were perfect. All of my speeches were dead on. And I didn't realize it until I left, that there's a structural thing that happens for those of us that take on either permanently or temporarily this funding thing. And it happens on the other side too. When you're, the way I am currently, in a position of looking for funding, you tend to be in a different role when you're talking to people from whom you want financial support. And so it's really, one of the things that I learned is it's really important, whether you're getting yeses or nos from your funders, to always think of it very structurally and never think of it personally, or it'll mess with your head. And it takes a long time to figure that out. Another thing that I learned was that I learned more from people that I violently disagree with than I learned from people that I am alike. I learned this when I was working for George W. Bush, and a huge, the national service movement in the United States is by and large not a movement of huge fans of the Republican administration. And it was actually really difficult to have some of those conversations because people would look at me and say, well, you're not really trying to build service. You're not really trying to make service strong. What you're really trying to do is undercut, or you really don't believe that we should be helping people. And I suddenly realized that because of my affiliation, people were willing to actually assume really bad things about me and my character. And it took a long time to begin to say, hey, you may completely disagree with the policies, the priorities, even maybe the mindset of somebody that I work for. But when I tell you I'm trying to help somebody, that's not a lie. Or when we say that we're trying to make a program stronger, there's ways that we can be working together. And I learned that I was doing the same thing when I was going into Senator Kennedy's office, and someone who had been so critical, I was assuming that what he and his staff were doing was trying to be disruptive or undermining to what we were doing. And in fact, no, he was trying to build something. We were trying to build something. But it really takes a lot of effort. And so one of the things that I would offer to you is to be thinking really hard about what are the things that you are the surest about? What are the things that you think you know the most, where you believe the most passionately? And then think, okay, who's on the other side of that issue? And am I thinking of that person as an object? That obviously they're on the other side of that issue because they're mean, stupid, willful, or are they on the other side of that issue because they simply disagree with me? And can I learn to get past the fact that people disagree with me about things that are the most important to me in order to be able to learn from them? That was something that took me many years, but I found in government, for-profit, now in nonprofit, that being able to spend less time objectifying and being personal about people I disagree with gives me a huge, huge advantage. So those are two thoughts that I have. I'd love to hear, did anybody come here hoping to hear a discussion about something in particular? Because I got questions for you if you don't have questions for me. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to know your thoughts on the movement of service. And I know it was about 5 years ago that the Serve America Act was signed, and that's had its ups and downs and starts and stops. But just sort of from your perspective and your experience, service in America, where are we headed, and what's the future of volunteerism and service look like?
This morning, I stayed with my in-laws last night. And this morning, my mother-in-law said, service is everywhere. It's just everywhere. I can't go to anything that's not service-related these days. And I was, sometimes when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So it's kind of hard to tell from doing service work. But it really does feel like in the nonprofit world, we're seeing this broad sweep where more organizations are thinking more intentionally about how do they become service enterprises. And there's more best practices about how to make service meaningful. And it feels like organizations like Teach for America, City Year, Habitat for Humanity, Red Cross, the sort of the big, $100 million plus service organizations are on the ascendancy. And it feels like the faith-based community is being stronger about engaging service, and there's more interfaith work around service. And the fights that we're seeing on Capitol Hill about funding seem to be about larger and larger amounts, even though there's still Republicans, unfortunately, they're saying we should zero it out. By and large, when the fights get, where the fights go, it's over larger and larger amounts. But it still feels really incremental. I don't think much has changed in terms of overall funding since I was running CNCS. It might have gone up 10%, which is, we were really hoping for more than double. But, so this week, the census releases the Civic participation index, and service is down. So we've gone from 64 million Americans volunteering to 62 million Americans volunteering. And that's at a time when the population is expanding. So overall, we're in a mixed message moment. Service is definitely getting more publicity. And I think the quality of service is going up. But the number of people that are saying each year, yeah, I did a service activity, it seems to be going down. It is a really mixed signal. There are more states coming online that are increasing service requirements in the schools. And we're seeing more adjudicated kids having service as an option. And we're seeing more rehabilitative service-based activities even for adult offenders. So it feels like the sector is expanding in terms of its capacity, but the pipeline is weak. And the folks that are not part of the service movement, the people that are part of the service movement are becoming stronger, and the people that are not part of the service movement aren't sort of coming into the pipeline.
Could that be correlated to the economic challenges that people have faced, and so volunteering is not an option because they're on a second job or a third job?
It absolutely could, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what I don't think that they've done the correlations yet on the data, but I'd love to see how the data correlates. At the same time that we have these economic challenges, and at the same time that we're hearing college freshmen saying that they are worried that they won't have the same standard of living that their parents had, we're also seeing college freshmen placing a higher priority on changing the world than they ever have in the past, according to the UCLA longitudinal study that's been so we're still seeing this phenomenon where this millennial generation, sort of loosely translated, the 34 to 18, is more cause-oriented than any generation before it. So there's huge, I think there's a huge reason for hope. I tend to believe that over the next, one of the things that gives me the most hope is seeing that the US military, which was 15 to 20 years ago, one of the most strident in opposition to the creation of AmeriCorps and National Service, because it believed that they would be competing for healthy young adults in service. Today, the military has become a really strident backer of service, and we're seeing projects with General McChrystal running the Franklin Project, which is about trying to make service normative, and the military tends to believe that that doing community service and doing national service is a huge boost, contributing to safety, to stability, and to recruitment for the armed services. So to me, that's one of those. There's just another indicator that shows that service should be continuing to be on the rise. Because and then the other folks that were really opposed to it, hard to remember, but the universities used to oppose national service a lot. They really didn't like the idea of any resources going to anything other than direct scholarships. But now the universities, by and large, are embracing national service as a model, and they're competing with each other to show how many AmeriCorps members, Peace Corps members they have on campus. So overall, I'm optimistic. I think it's a good trend, but you can't ignore some of the straight-up data that shows that certain kinds of service are going in the wrong direction. Yes?
I work with Special Olympics, and our whole organization is pretty much built on volunteerism. And we are seeing, which I think a lot of organizations are seeing, which is this kind of place where our hard, strident, core volunteers are aging. And there's just not that group coming up behind them. And I think a lot of it is economic. I think a lot of the people that we've relied on in the past are working two jobs. They're single moms and single dads. So there is that whole, idea of how do we reintroduce service and position service, knowing that a lot of people create opportunities that, how do you create opportunities for people that would love to help but can't spend a whole day somewhere or come to meetings every night? But the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the idea of service learning in school. I go into so many schools where, our kids do service, and it's not meaningful. It's about hours to put on a resume to get to college. And for us, it's really, we get a lot of these kids because it looks really good to volunteer for Special Olympics, but then we get them out on a field or something and they're shell-shocked because they didn't know what they just got themselves into. So it's, for me, for the schools, there's the issue too of it's wonderful to promote service, but how do we create meaningful service so that kids don't think that they have to do it to build a resume? Because that conflicts with I think the purpose and the value of what everyone is trying to do with the service.
So one of the, first of all, we just affirm that it is a challenge. Service can happen without meaning, and that's a deep challenge. We're seeing a lot of organizations in the position of Special Olympics where your infrastructure is catering to one kind of volunteer, and it's almost like you need to build a flanker brand to be able to come up with another system to bring in this new kind of volunteer that has very different expectations. One of the things, though, that when you look at things over a long scope, one of the things you notice is that organizations that start doing service cynically don't stay cynical. It's fascinating to me how many schools start off doing meaningless service. I'll note. A lot of people have asked me, well, what about, should we really be giving an award to this corporation which clearly made this philanthropic donation or set up this foundation so completely cynically in order for the PR or in order to exchange market share? And from what I can tell, service and caring in general are the sorts of things that are so sticky that when organizations get involved in them, sometimes for the most cynical, tactical, transactional reasons, and end up staying in them because they're meaningful and they make a difference, and mostly because the people that make up that institution get this huge benefit from being connected. So that the corporations that have been doing this stuff for 15 years, you look back at their 15 years ago stuff and it was all about employee relations, and today they're doing really meaningful philanthropic work. A lot of schools are in the same position. So I would say that the antidote to schools that are doing it more in ways that are less meaningful is not to be the critic in the stop mode. It's to be the smiling advocate of introducing more meaning to what the schools are doing. And my sense is that schools embrace it because if they're doing it anyhow, they want the kids to learn. They want it to be meaningful. They just don't know how. Now, as far as the second problem, we have a new generation of volunteers. They're a little more self-directed. They require more schedule flexibility. They are they start off with a little more of sometimes a little more privilege that they don't know how to sort out. And so helping folks through this race, class, privilege discussion seems to be a deeper, more experiential and harder discussion with this generation than it's been in the past. And so yeah, it can be really difficult. I would say that more organizations that used to use volunteers for highly transactional activities are going to be using volunteers for more strategic activities in the future. We're going to see more people able to help build strategic plans. And when you have coaches in, for example, Special Olympics, they're going to want more access to the discussions around where are we competing, how is it being fashioned, how are we setting policies for our athletes. They're not going to be content to have the paid staff be making all the strategic decisions while they act as a labor force without access to the C-suite. And so I think it's going to take lots of organizations, new ways to figure out how to engage this new kind of volunteer. There was another hand here. Yes.
I had a question. I was just wondering, we talked a lot about funding and lots of programs being sort of starved for funding or just figuring out funding issues from the government and that kind of thing. But I was wondering, what do you see as the role for government, especially different bodies of government in inspiring service? We have the State Department of Education and that kind of thing. So I was wondering, what do you see these government bodies like, do you see them more as funders? Like, do they give money to local organizations who are implementing service projects on the ground? Or do we see like creation of sort of a national sort of service program, like more like AmeriCorps sort of things like that? I was wondering where you see that happening.
So, yes, I think that there's a role for both. I'm really excited to see things like FEMA Corps, where we've got sort of an expansion of the AmeriCorps ethic through more people being able to be involved in disaster response and relief. I think we're going to see similar things around national parks. I think we're likely to see some activities around social services and healthcare. I'm hoping that we'll see an expansion of programs like the Peace Corps. I think so. I think that there's a role for government in actually running and driving programs and bringing more citizens into those programs to be full participants in sort of civic renewal and engagement. I also think that there's a really important role for government to be funding programs that work and helping them get to scale. There's a lot of discussion now about the role of government in funding innovation. Personally, I think that's a disaster. Government is the least innovative entity. Even when I was running a government agency, I couldn't for the life of me make my agency innovative. The bureaucracy and the requirements for Congress are so heavy, so soupy and thick. What we have to do is so difficult, and the requirements that we put on our grantees are so complex that this idea that just because we want to, we can pick and fund innovation, which is supposed to be fast, nimble, flexible, able to learn lessons, turn on a dime. We can't fund those kinds of things. The right, in my opinion, and people will disagree with this, in my opinion, the right thing, government, the thing that it has behind it that no one has like it is mass and scale. It should be looking for the innovations that are coming from the nonprofit sector, from the private sector, from people that actually are able to do innovation. And when things are ready to scale, it should be testing scale, and then it should be making big bets to be growing programs. That's why it's so great that government's behind Teach for America and City here, and some of the other national service programs. I don't know if that's a good answer. Yes.
It's a little delayed now, but I thought I would add your question about the Special Olympics. I just have like a personal experience that I think would be helpful. So I started the Kids Care Club, which if you don't know, it's a youth-led service club under Generation On, Mix of Light, when I was in 6th grade, and I've been running it ever since 6th grade. About 50 youth members in my community, so I've been dealing with that same exact problem, but from a youth perspective of trying to get my peers, younger and older than me, to engage in service when everyone really, what I've seen, a lot of people, they just want to put it on their resume, and I've noticed that you have to use that to really grab them, use that to your advantage more than see it as a disadvantage, which I think you pointed out as well. So on all my flyers, I always put like big, like get community service hours, because what I've seen from the past is that when you advertise that, that's how you grab them immediately, and then from there, they will automatically, maybe not the first time, maybe the first time they may be a little shell-shocked, but from the times further on, they'll be more engaged, and my whole mission is to show my peers that service can be fun. So immediately I may grab them by the service hours for their resume, but after the next few projects, I grab them in from the meaningful service that we'd be doing.
And can I just add on to that from a different perspective? I think that's a great way to catch them, and then to reinforce the experience and the potential transformational moment within themselves and the other through a really tight story. I think people are engaged and fascinated by stories, and it's like Nick Kristof said in his article years ago about that one child or that one particular moment. If it's a really tight, and of course these days 2 to 3 minute video or something super tight, super easy to watch, that just sort of goes, wow. I think hooking them with that and then pushing behind with a really tightly developed but authentic
it's
story.
We have so many beautiful stories about kids that'll say, oh, I volunteered to get points on my resume and my whole life's changed, because they've worked with athletes. I think our challenge, and I think for all different service projects it's a little bit different, but our challenge is that they are working with individuals with sometimes significant disabilities. So it's hard to just show up. We have to do like this training and everything, but for working the games and stuff, it is interesting to have those kids go and do the recruiting that have had that life-changing experience. Because I do agree with you. I do go in with a smile and like, I don't care, give me whoever you've got. You've got the kids that are almost truant, that start coming to Special Olympics, and suddenly their teachers are like, oh my God, on time for class every day. So it is, you do the naysayers, they show up and they're texting and they're like looking around, and then 6 months later they're, but it's a struggle to, I think my issue is kind of also with the people in the school. Like, how do I get these teachers to kind of, to position it about more than just getting your, because I hear the teachers say, oh, this is really good, you need your 20 hours. Like, they don't support us in helping, the kids are great, they may come in just for the wrong reasons at first, or, be cynical, but it's to get the teachers to also see service as this sort of thing that changes lives. Some get it, and some, like anything
One of the
else.
hardest things to set up are effective site visits, where your circles of stakeholders can see and touch what it is that you're doing in such a way that when they're done with that site visit, they talk about you in a way you'd like to be talked about. I think the art of setting up site visits is a really critical thing for any good nonprofit, because you have lots of people like teachers, like others, that you're not getting on a regular volunteer basis, but you need them to be saying the right things about you. And so figuring out what do you want them to see and what kind of experience should be had in the site visit so that they sort of get it at both the intellectual and emotional level. It's a hard thing to do right. How many of you are wrestling with measurement and impact as something that's difficult to do either for funders or for other stakeholders? That's interesting. I was expecting more. Well, I would just, one of the things that I've noted is that if you're not one of these organizations that's in the $80 to $100 million a year, no matter how much people tell you to be measuring outcomes and impacts, don't actually do that. You have to be figuring out what your proxy measurements are. Proxies for impact. If you think that you can actually get to outcomes and impacts without spending many millions of dollars, you're wasting a lot of resources, because actually measuring how people change their behavior in a way that's deep, meaningful, and shows causality is something that only really, really big organizations can do. And the trick is to figure out what are the outputs that you're giving, and why are you confident that those outputs should be leading to an appropriate impact.
Is that because of over time? You really see impact over time? And
you see impact over time, and you have to measure it by broad populations, and then you have to do some sort of random assignment to be able to show that it's not being caused by other influences on the lives. And if the ultimate impacts are more stability, better, more happiness, more connectedness, your ability to actually measure that is crazy limited by resources.
Empirically, but what do you think about just qualitative, like anecdotal, qualitative? A lot of people put a lot of time into that, like the
Yeah,
story.
I think that the storytelling is one or two top most important things to be able to do in this business. But I also think measures are very important. I think you need to pick what your outputs are. You need to figure out how to connect those outputs so that you have the research that says, when we do quality outputs of such and such, within certain kinds of quality, we believe that those lead to these kinds of impacts because of this study that Boys and Girls Clubs did, or YMCA did. So you find the other research that shows how certain kinds of outputs connect to outcomes, and then you piggyback on that research by showing how your outputs sort of match those. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be esoteric, but this is a place that a lot of people get really stuck.
And to just tag on to that, I think a lot of programs and nonprofits don't deeply understand the need to articulate a theory of change so that they can go back to that and point to that as they're trying to articulate all of because all of their messaging comes out of that ultimately.
Right, that's right. Yes?
How would you measure that experience we're talking about, that change experience? Like, would you survey kids before and after, and then just, like, different, say, outcomes? There's the outcome, yes, we fed so many people, yes, we built so many houses, but on the volunteer end of it, the change in the volunteer.
So I would have two tracks. I would do the surveys before and the after I would do multiple. So you do after 1 time, after 5 times, after 10 times what's happening, and I would be thinking in terms of skills, attitudes, behaviors, which of those things are changing and how. But I would be doing that basically all self-reporting, so that a funder might be happy with it, but they might say, well, you're not really proving it because it's all self-reported. And then I would be looking really hard at the deeper research that's been done out of the University of Texas, University of Michigan, and in Minneapolis around what are the best practices around service learning and how do they contribute. And I'd be showing that our outputs are aligning with those best practices in the following ways, so that we know that because we're hitting these 4 outputs, we should be able to trust that we're having a transformational impact. And by the way, our anecdotes and our surveys are showing that that tends to be the case. So you're not proving it, you're using the surveys and the anecdotes to bolster it. And then from the hard research perspective, what you're doing is you're tying to other people's hard research. Yes?
I'd like to ask about, hear more about faith-based service.
Sure.
And particularly interfaith.
So how many of you are connected directly, where your core organization starts from a faith-based place? It's fascinating to me.
We're not faith-based, but we work with a lot of kids who are Muslim and Catholic, and so it's there. It's not our mission.
How many of your organizations partner with faith-based organizations? Still, it's a fascinating disconnect, and it's across the national service field, whether it's in the service learning space, AmeriCorps space, or others, that 60% of America's volunteers come directly from, are generated by the faith-based community. And yet, when I talk to people who rely on volunteers, they're not actually talking to, partnered with, connected to the faith-based community. The other thing that's really interesting about the faith-based community is that those programs, there are certain kinds of places where faith-based organizations, I wouldn't say exclusively, but dominantly have the most effective programs. It's the hardest stuff. It's the adjudicated youth, substance abuse, domestic violence issues, recidivism, prisoner reentry issues. Again, not dominant. There's a good number of non-faith-based organizations that are doing good work, but most of the organizations that are really doing good, proven work are faith-based in those really hard areas. And so it's fascinating to me that that our broader community, our service community, operates in a way that's sort of disconnected from those communities.
Why do you think that is?
I think that it gets to what I was saying earlier about people having a hard time relating and learning from people that they vehemently disagree with. And I think that in our country there's this divide around sort of values, different value sets, and there's just this sort of discomfort with the more, between the more progressive movements around providing social services and social change and the more religious movements because of the positioning on certain social issues. And so it prevents this really powerful opportunity for the kind of service work. I mean, just do a mind experiment, how you would partner with an organization that opposed several things you cared about, let's say gay marriage and immigration reform, a couple other things, but they were kick-ass, the best organization that you could imagine at dealing with youth recidivism. And right, how would you figure out how to work with them in a way that felt authentic and real, and where you weren't, right? It's hard.
Does that also have to do with funders, though? If funders know that you're partnering and they are either secular, you only support secular activity, I mean, I can imagine.
Yeah, I do think
there's a lot of complications there.
I do think the funding community is a piece of it, and funders are there are some funders that are less, that fund the faith-based, and funders that fund the non-faith-based, and they seldom fund each other. I note that a good 70% of American philanthropy goes to well, I guess that goes to both religion and alma maters. So I can't remember right now what the breakdown is for religion.
Do you have any recommendations for people who want to work either partner with faith-based organizations or interfaith?
Yeah, so on the faith-based organizations, it's really about the leadership, finding the rabbi or the imam or the clergy that is interested in the issue, and seeing if they're interested in bringing that to I was just thinking last night at Washington Hebrew, Ahmed Iqbar, I think is his name, and Rabbi Lustig did a joint discussion about some historical perspective on Palestine. And it's interesting how that doesn't require interfaith. In a lot of ways, interfaith is a movement that's about sort of what do we have in common versus what divides us, but an interfaith per se ends up being highly philosophical, theological, and sometimes distracting from actually getting work done. And my own sense is that it's easier just to think in terms of faith-based service. You get folks from the community center, you get folks from the church, you get folks from the synagogue, and you can all plant a garden. And if you think of that as diverse service, I think it's easier than if you think of it as interfaith, because once you're thinking of it as interfaith, then there's a level of programming and philosophy that sort of has to sort of be baked into it.
Do you have any reflections on or insights to either the millennial generation or the next generation, Generation Z, in relation to faith-based service or faith-based activities?
Boy, you're touching me in a nerve right now. I'm spending a lot of, so I can't speak to faith-based broadly. I'll talk about the Jewish community. It's really interesting. The millennial, these 20, 30-something young Jews have very little interest in institutions. They have very little interest in thinking of themselves as practicing or as religious. I'm leaving out the ultra-Orthodox sects for now. And yet they tend to connect to a sense of their religious heritage as having something to do with morality and ethics and human rights and making the world a better place, which to some extent is really interesting and provides an opportunity for doing a lot of service work using Jewish values, but it also provides a little bit of a conundrum, because the question is, what's the difference between this activity and sort of broader, just human, humanism, right? And so there's huge numbers, and my sense is, I can't speak to it with any precision, my sense is that this is not just a Jewish phenomenon, that sort of across the millennial sector, there's a lot less willingness to invest in institutions. There's a lot less willingness to be a joiner. People want to participate in things as opposed to join things. And so there's a much broader sense of wanting to be a part of a world, a positive influence in a world that's better, but less tribalism. And so for most organizations that are fundamentally built on tribal principles, capturing this next generation and energizing that sense of optimism and that belief in themselves and their ability to change the world and make the world better and connecting that to their religious values and principles, it's a real challenge. So I think it's an exciting and worthwhile challenge, and in some ways they're, I think, leading us to a great place. But it's a challenge, and it creates a lot of head-scratching moments. Any of our millennials in the room want to share any thoughts about that?
I'm 28, and I came to this conference 5 years ago. I was in AmeriCorps for 2 years, and that's how I got to this conference in this whole field. But I'm feeling this, I have all these people I served with in AmeriCorps with, or was involved with service with, and now it's kind of this period between like really establishing your life and your family and your future, and how to make sure service is a core component of that. I mean, like even tonight we're having a service learning young professionals event, and it may just seem like a networking event, but truly it's because if we don't really welcome the millennials or the young professionals that are attending this conference, then who's going to lead the field in the future? So it's not just about going to a bar. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do we capture them after maybe they do that year of service or they leave college and those pieces?
I think my experience relates to what you were saying about like how people don't really relate to being religious per se, but they relate to values that they grew up with. I think that's sort of my experience. My church, and I kind of we grew up going to an Orthodox Christian church. So I mean, my parents grew up in a very sort of religious sort of setting, that kind of stuff. So they had these sort of set my experience, I people think that it's more nuanced. It doesn't have to be, it's like some of these stories you can interpret these things in different ways rather than the way most of our parents are interpreting them and that kind of stuff. So, but I think definitely the idea of service and all that kind of stuff. I feel like I think what you were saying about not identifying as being so much religious, but identifying the values that you have is you really do identify with the values. I think that's correct. I think that's been the experience of people in my community at least.
So I just realized I've kept you longer than we were contracted to stay. This was 45 minutes. I'm.
I don't see anybody protesting.
Okay. But I don't want anyone to feel awkward if you have to go do something next. So, any last question? Last thought? I just want to share that I'm very inspired to be here. This whole conference and the connection of NYLC to Global Youth Service Day, the work that's being done, and the continuing drive to connect our young folks with the values of otherness